I want to talk through something that I use almost every day in my work with clients, and I think it'd just be really helpful to have in a simple video form that I can share so that people can see it again and to learn it and relearn it and revisit it as they need to. I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma, how trauma affects the brain, how trauma affects our experience of living life, and what we can do to work towards healing with regard to trauma. And when I say trauma, I want to be both precise and vague at the same time, because there is what I will call capital T trauma, which is situations that you experience in which your life actually is in danger. But then there's what would be called lowercase t trauma, which is any number of experiences in life where you feel some kind of threat or danger, and it may not be that your life is actually in danger. It may just be like a fight or an argument with somebody you really care about, but the same brain mechanisms are at work to some degree as would be at work if your life were really in danger, like say if you were being attacked by a bear or in a car accident. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain, and I've got a little drawing here. Very simple. Sometimes I think my brain drawing looks a little bit like E.T.'s head, and I do this a lot in sessions. So I'm going to talk about a couple parts of the brain, and I want to say I'm not a neuroscientist. This is a very simple, basic way of talking about some of the mechanisms in the brain. It's actually a lot more complicated than anyone really understands, but this is a simplified version that is true enough to be called true for the purposes of what we're dealing with. So what we've got here is the brain, and up here in the front is the part that's called the hippocampus. That part has to do with language, logic, linear thinking, and narrative. So your capacity to put things together in a sensible order and story that makes sense of your life. So like you can look at your day yesterday and go, oh, I know what I did. I know what happened. It all fits together and it kind of can make sense of it. And then this part over here in the middle of the brain is called the amygdala. That has to do with emotion and fight or flight or freeze. So like when you're in danger, these are your sort of survival-based mechanisms. And as you're going throughout your regular day, ideally, these two parts are both active. They're kind of talking to each other, so you can be emotionally engaged with your life and your world, and you can be sensibly, cognitively, logically engaged with your world. And those two parts are sort of working in tandem. You're able to integrate your experience with regard to how it impacts you emotionally and make sense of it logically. Now, let's talk about what happens if you experience some form of trauma. Let's say like a car accident. If you get in a car accident, you don't have time to use your hippocampus very well. You don't have time to logically think out, what do I need to do to survive in this situation? You've got to make snap decisions, and the hippocampus isn't fast enough for that. So what happens if in a situation like that is this goes dark. You're not thinking logically, you're not thinking rationally anymore, because that's not benefiting your survival. And this goes bright. You get into fight or flight mode. You're doing what you need to do, snap decisions to survive. Those decisions are very, I'll call them like low resolution decisions. They're not necessarily the best, most well thought out decisions, but they're fast. And they, in many cases will get you where you need to go. So like, I got to get out of this car right now, or the bear is chasing me, I gotta get the heck out of here as fast as possible. Now here's an interesting thing that you might have noticed if you've ever been in a car accident. When the car accident is happening, you're not necessarily processing a lot, you're not making sense of everything, but afterwards, when your body starts to calm down and you're with somebody with whom you feel safe, whether it's like an authority figure, like a police officer comes, or a friend comes and helps you, and you start sort of calming down, and then you very naturally start to talk about what happened. You start to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe what happened. Like, I was just driving down the street, and I was like in the left turn lane, and then this, I thought it was ready for me to go, and then like this other car came out of nowhere, and oh my gosh, and then we flipped, and then all this, you start naturally walking through the events that happened and putting them together in narrative form. And what you're doing naturally in that is bringing your hippocampus back online and working through an integration of your experience by having these two parts of your brain talk to each other again. And if that is able to happen, well, then the experience doesn't need to set in the form of unprocessed trauma that might later result in all kinds of symptoms like, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms or PTSD. Now, let's look at the same information in a slightly different way. I have this little graph here. You don't need to understand math very well to make sense of this graph, so I'll explain it. It's pretty simple. On one axis of the graph, you have arousal. I'm not talking about sexual arousal. I'm just talking about any kind of activation. So you are awake, you are active to some degree, mentally, physically. And then this other axis is time. So what I want to show is you need to have a certain degree of arousal just to be aware in your life. Otherwise, you're dead or unconscious. So, you start your day and you come up past a certain threshold of arousal where you can engage your world and integrate your experience. And let's say you're going throughout your day and various things happen, and maybe it's a stressful day and you're going higher and higher and higher. And then, various things are going on. And then, some event, like let's say, you're at your job and you find out you made a big mistake and you're in big trouble, and here comes your boss, and you start to sort of kind of redline. You get overwhelmed and you reach a point where you start hyperventilating and you're having something along the lines of a panic attack. Well, you've crossed a certain threshold where you're no longer able to integrate your experience. Something similar to what happened over here. You're not able to think and make sense of things anymore, and you're going into a kind of survival mode. And that's where I said earlier that the amygdala is associated with fight or flight or freeze. Your hippocampus shuts down. So when you're in this little zone here that I put these dotted lines here, when you're in that zone, you can make sense of your world, you can integrate your experience, you can process your emotions and your thoughts and put things together logically and linearly. But when you cross a certain threshold, that can't happen anymore. You can't do that. You're in fight or flight, or what might happen later is you shut down and you go into freeze mode. So this little window here, this zone within which you can integrate your experience, is called the window of tolerance. This zone up here, when you cross a certain threshold and you can't integrate your experience anymore up high, is called hyperarousal. You are aroused too much to be able to integrate your experience. And this zone down here is called hypoarousal. You're not aroused enough to be able to integrate your experience.